Chapter 65. It all flashed by in a blur. She could feel distant, unremembered feelings of joy that were not her own, but so much more hate then that it drowned out anything else. Not that it was solely hate, perhaps, too, there was a desire to protect things, save things. But it had all become so corrupted and changed, that even layers upon layers of shining and beautiful fangs could do little to hide it. Lorelei did not feel fear, however. Maybe it was some greater instinct, or maybe she had just stopped feeling fear. The latter scared her a little, but perhaps it was a price you had to pay, being a witch. No matter what that meant. Around her, the darkness of what she assumed to be Dragonov's maw had faded entirely, to be replaced by an endless sea of blue. At first, she had assumed it to be an actual sea, an ocean of crystal clear water, instead of the cloudless sky that it was. Dragonov did not speak to her, floating contently on the airstreams high above and waiting for her to speak. But of course, that made sense, she knew instinctively what sort of place this was. Lorelei felt certain she would have even if she had never met Leopold, but the similarities between his sanctuary and Dragonov's were present even in the absences. It was strange, though. The great holy dragon had nothing besides sky in his deepest mind, and it struck her as a little lonely.
"You don't have to talk, if you don't want to,"
Lorelei began, and was surprised by how chastising she sounded. She hadn't meant to, but perhaps the effect was also part of being a witch. Mildred would have taken much the same tone, and with time being of the essence, perhaps this was not the place for pleasantries.
"I am sorry."
Dragonov's voice was not as quiet as it had been in sleep, nor as loud as his constant roars of anguish and vitriol were when awake. Perhaps this was what Dragonov sounded like at his best, how he wanted to sound, when the world itself and his long sleep had not sapped so much of the great dragon's mind.
"You must listen." "I will listen. But you have to help me understand, because I'm confused. There's no way I'll be able to explain things to my friends. We can't help you, if we can't understand you."
"Yes," Dragonov began.
"And no. I am sorry."
She bit back her reply, but being friends with Dennis had taught her patience, and even if the Dark Lord could weigh forth with surprising eloquence when he wanted to, she imagined that Dragonov was having trouble even imagining his own voice. There was no need to be rude, not now.
"Are you okay? Are you going to be able to talk to me, here?" "I think I can. So I have to."
Now she was certain she heard it, the pain in the dragon's voice. Despite the fact that there was no ground in sight, she could roll through the sky easily, and despite how huge Dragonov was, she seemed to know instinctively where the wounds were, even in his psyche. They were strange things, looking for all the world like they had healed over, but she could feel the hate poisoning him, even here. Leopold's magic, weak as it was, had never been the problem, only what weakened Dragonov enough for resentment and loss to do the rest. Not that the bleeding off of his energy was helping.
"Hold on. I'm not too good at this yet, but I think I can make things hurt less. Hold still, okay?"
She wasn't sure if smiling at a dragon meant the same thing as it did for humans. She knew her own teeth were much smaller and much less frightening than his, and perhaps he might take it as a gesture of dominance, or a threat. But the great dragon stared down at her, and winced in pain, but opened his huge maw, and she realized with horrible sadness that he was trying to smile, too. The wounds ran deep. Where magic had run out, true magic had torn and sunken and festered. It was vile stuff, and she knew just enough to be certain that she could not remove it. But she tried. Her fingers reached into the viscera exposed by Dragonov's wounds, pulling forth the sickly graying matter and tossing it into the sky, but it simply caked over itself with every passing moment, refusing her every attempt to free him from the stuff. She did not know when she began to cry, but it had certainly happened at some point. Lorelei had hoped that maybe some power greater than herself, one of Ruslana's contrarian gods, perhaps, might take pity and blast the ruin from Dragonov. But all she could do was cry. After some time, Dragonov, wheezing, placed a great claw far above her head.
It is fine. It is the way of things. No. It's not fine. You're hurting, and you're hurting other people, because of something we can change. This is ridiculous. If I were just a better witch.
That wasn't the only problem, of course, and Lorelei knew it wasn't a matter of her magic being weak. These were old wounds, rent by Leopold but torn by time. She wasn't going to be able to do this on her own. Maybe Mildred wouldn't have been able to do anything, either. But she wanted to, desperately. And the feeling of powerlessness, it clung to her like.
You must let it go. You should not be like me. I'm so sorry.
Lorelei whispered, drying her eyes. A witch could cry, after all, but her tears were valuable things, and there was work to be done. There would be time for her to cry, in silence, later. She could not afford to let that poison spread to her, not now.
What is it you're here to tell me? Is it something I can do, to help you? There is no help for me. I think. The world here will end. It has ended many times before. It will end many more times. There is no hope.
She refused to accept that, some core of her soul refused to accept that. Even if every being in the entire island, all her friends and every magician and the universe itself had coalesced into one force that told her to give up all hope, she could not, she could not. Dragonov noticed her shaking fingertip, colorless smoke exhaling from his snout in a great and reptilian sigh.
You must listen to me and leave with those you call your friends. Attempting to change anything at all will only lead to more hurt, more wounded. And then they will all be forgotten and discarded, and even their pain gone. I do not want that. Please.
But Lorelei's refusal continued to grow in her heart, feeling like it might spring free if she didn't speak. Pulling her hat low down over her head so that it completely covered her eyes, Lorelei pointed a finger up through the maze of blue, knowing that Dragonov must strain to see it, and her as well.
We can't just leave and pretend nothing here mattered. We wouldn't abandon our friends, and I won't abandon you. To wake into loneliness, and then fade back into dreams. I won't.
Lorelei felt the edges of the sanctuary. It was quite small, really. It just looped around where Dragonov flew, giving him an endless expanse of featureless and repetitive sky to call his mental citadel. She didn't wish to break it, so she followed the lines of the place with great care, Dragonov watching her with listless disinterest.
Nothing you do here will matter. I am telling you to leave. Soon, I will let you out of here, and use the moment of cognition to leave. I will fight Lazarus, until we are both destroyed. As it has been. As it will always be.
Lorelei wasn't even sure what she was looking for, exactly, maybe some sort of shift in Dragonov's thoughts, but even here they were overwhelmed with the desire to wreak vengeance against his ancient rival. And though she could see clearly how they had not always been rivals, those memories were fragmented words, written in different tongues that she could only just comprehend. But there was hope, and the more she looked, the more she knew it to be true. At the very edge of this sanctuary, Dragonov had wove his thoughts into a barrier, perhaps against the madness that consumed him while awake. It was a weak barrier, because his waking sanity was torn and weak. Lorelei frowned, and eased the brim of her wide, frequently repatched hat over her mussed braid.
What are you doing?
Dragonov had feigned disinterest here, too, but the faintest hint of curiosity could be heard in his booming voice. Lorelei turned away, hunched over while trying to remember the shape and feel of hammers, of nails, of little bits of string. They were alien concepts in the depths of the mind, and places without feel nor substance.
Could be something important. It's very secret, very powerful magic. I can't guarantee it'll work, maybe it'll backfire horribly.
She laughed, and it wasn't a very good witch-like laugh. Mildred would have cackled, much more spiritedly, at her for the attempt. But here in the void of sky, it might have well been a ghoulish and practiced gloating of the most nightmarish kind. Dragonov craned his mighty neck, attempting to see what Lorelei was doing, though of course, she wasn't doing anything, swinging an imaginary hammer at an imaginary wall.
If you are destroying something, please stop. Have I not suffered enough?
For a minute, she hesitated, not because of what she was doing, of course, but the sheer exhaustion in Dragunov's voice was enough to move the hardest of hearts. He could no longer even beg nor plead, only request with the tired tone of something great and mighty that is no longer able to even remember what it felt like to be great, or mighty.
Humph. No. And I'm not destroying anything.
Relief flooded his voice, for even as broken as Dragunov was, the idea of losing this vestige of sanity must have been a terrible burden. He was silent for a great time afterwards, but finally curiosity was too much even for the great dragon to bear, and...
What are you doing, then? I'm repairing this. It seems it got broken down, somehow, so I figured that's the least I can do. There are a few things I can't fix of course, though given how strong and powerful you are, I'm sure you can finish the rest with me.
She smiled, and placed one hand against his resting claw. Her fingers were barely able to cover one of his many glistening scales, but somehow she still felt that he seemed smaller, at the moment. Dragunov did not shift or move or reject her claim, eyes shut.
What happens if I do nothing? Nothing. It's perfectly fine if you do. I'd have wasted all this time, of course, but you brought me here to tell me something, so it won't be time poorly spent. I waited for you to speak, and if you still have more to say, please just view this as my way of passing the time.
And he did, and she continued to work. Her work was pointless, of course, she couldn't even mend the wounds in Dragunov's scales, let alone the ones in his psyche.
You will leave, then?
She answered without answering, and smiled enigmatically. She had a teacher skilled in both.
Very well. When the world ends, it will return again. And all this will pass. Do you think you will remember it?
This time, Lorelei nodded. She knew she would remember the island that she had been on now, for the rest of her life, as long or as short as it would be. Even if everyone else forgot or chose to move on from it.
I couldn't forget, even if you want me to. I'm sorry.
He didn't seem displeased by the answer, however, fading back into silence once more. Lorelei wiped imaginary sweat from her brow and lay back in her wheelchair, staring into the endless expanse of false blue sky. Time passed, and so focused did she grow on the unchanging patterns of the sanctuary around them that she had not realized that Dragunov had begun to gesture ineffectively at the same points that she had. Silently, she smiled, and the two set to work.
Lorelei!
Ruslana yelled, but as fast as she was running, it would be too slow. She knew it, she could feel that pit opening in her stomach and... Even as the concrete swam against her feet, the fear melted off of her to be replaced by an unstable and overwhelming confusion. Dragunov's maw had entirely encased Lorelei, easily to the point where it would have taken just a single snap of his jaws to crush the witch into red mulch. But the great dragon had taken one step back, mud surging around his leg. Then another. His eyes were different, looking more like freshly cast gold than the distant and frightening golden spheres she had seen before. And his jaw closed slowly, far away from Lorelei, who seemed exhausted, but otherwise fine, and hinging into place with an almost mechanical slowness to it. The great dragon stared down at her, staring back at him, and Ruslana was not sure what expression he must have seen on hers. Fear, perhaps, and worry, and perhaps hatred or anger or something more than that, things that she did her best to hide with those. And he seemed to understand. Without any words, the great dragon spread wings as grand and beautiful as sunlight, and took off into the sky.
It's going to be all right.
Lorelei whispered, and Ruslana knew that the witch wasn't talking to her, or at least not solely to her.
Everything is going to be all right, no matter how hard the road becomes.
Then, a slightly embarrassed expression subsumed the quiet forcefulness of her voice, and she beat her forehead within strike of her hand.
Oh, don't tell me I let the portal close, F.
Coughing, Ruslana eased over, still trying to get over the shock of seeing Dragunov leave as simply as if Lorelei had asked it of him, and perhaps she had.
Don't think most people would have been able to hold open a place between while in the clutches of a dragon. Are you unhurt?
Lorelei scratched the back of her neck, smiling sheepishly. The sleeve of her sweater fell down around her hand, making her look smaller than she was.
Fine. I do feel a bit embarrassed, but there are definitely worse things to feel, right? I'll just open it back up, and we'll be set to wait this out. I don't think Dragunov will bother us much more, either. I think.
Ruslana felt a swarm of questions boil up inside of her, and still wanted to check on Lorelei, but the nervousness felt like it was going to swim up over her face, anxious and red and embarrassed, if she let it.
As you were then, Lorelei. Though I'm going to, wait out here, with you. If you don't mind. If it won't distract you from... Which things?
Lorelei shook her head and smiled, and said nothing. Ruslana's worries started to sift, and melt away, and as she could see the figure of Dragunov growing fainter in the sky above, she heard the crackle of electricity as the portal sprang back into life. Chapter end.